I'm Phillip Barcio, Communications Manager at Kavi Gupta Gallery in Chicago, and I'm joined here today with Los Angeles-based artist Kour Pour, whose show Familiar Spirits is on view at the gallery right now. Kour, welcome to Chicago.
Thank you. Just so happy to finally be here for the show. It's the second show I've opened since quarantine. And so much of having an exhibition is interacting with people and being in a new space. So I feel very lucky right now.
Especially with the topic of this show, because Familiar Spirits being the title, but then also just how much friends and family had to do with the content in this show. Talk to me about the ideas of friends and family that sort of inspired this work.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with just kind of my background. So I've lived in Los Angeles since 2005 and just became a citizen in January. When you come here on different visas and green cards, can make traveling a little difficult. So it feels good to finally be able to make this my home. And I think, most of what I'm doing in the studio is precisely that, is creating a home for myself and for other people like myself. So like I said, I grew up in the UK. My father is from Iran and moved to the UK when he was 14 years old in '79, which is during the Iranian Revolution. And my mother was British and was a foster child. So she grew up all around the UK with her sister. And I think when my mum and dad met, in my mind it was, both of them were there without family and connected and wanted to build that together. So got married, I think at 19, and then had myself and my younger brother and sister. That experience informs a lot of my work, being both mixed-raced and kind of living in between different cultures and growing up in the UK where I would hear this question all the time, which was, where are you from? And I would obviously answer, oh, I'm from Exeter, I grew up in Devon. And then they'd say, okay, but of course. So I think, especially when you're younger, when I heard where are you from so many times, I would start asking that question about everything else around me growing up, which is kind of how this show comes together and many other of my bodies of work.
What do you mean you'd start asking that question? Do you mean you would start asking where everything is from and everybody is from? And
Sure, yeah, exactly. With that question, like, where are you from? What does that mean? When we ask, if you have sushi, for example, in Los Angeles, it's Japanese cuisine, but I'm eating it in LA, in the United States, So much like myself, I grew up in England, I was born there. My nationality was British. I had my Iranian heritage, and now I live in the States with an American passport too. So, is something, when we say is something from somewhere, does that mean that it has to be produced there, made there? Is it imported there? Is it borrowed? And it's really thinking deeper about that question.
That really brings a lot into context with this show.
Yeah.
And with the other bodies of work I've been familiar with that you've done in the past as well. And it really is something I want to dive a little deeper into today, is that idea of do we ever really know where anything is from? And even if we can trace something to, say, a geographical origin or to even a particular person, to trace the lineage of people's influences, especially in terms of like cultures, to think back to a time before nations, before borders.
Exactly.
So even if something can be traced to a certain culture or individual, how do we find out who influenced them? And how do we really find out what the roots are? Could we talk a little bit about your processes and how you make the work that you make before we dive into that?
Yeah, I feel like we can cover so much right now, but the majority of this show is produced through block printing. which is something I found my way to through Japanese art, ukiyo-e prints. And I probably got to that through Impressionist art history, when you're looking at Van Gogh, for example, and seeing how he is extracting elements from these different Japanese prints. And it's something he wrote about a lot too, that his art wouldn't be what it was without that influence. And so, I've been studying these prints for a long time. I didn't go to school for printmaking, so I had no kind of formal training in regards to printmaking, which I think was helpful because I did not clearly understand it. So I started trying things that perhaps one wouldn't typically try, printing at this large scale, 8 feet, printing on canvas, using these different block inks. And so for this show in particular, I turned to this tiger motif. And the tiger is, I think, an icon that you find in many cultures. China, Korea, Japan, as well as Indian art. It shows up in Persian art, Tibetan art. It's one of these images where you can trace, again, this history, this lineage, and see how it's showing up in each setting. And so within this show, there are 13 different tiger images that are all drawn from ink paintings, many of them from about the 17th century and onwards. And with that image in the different bodies of work, I'm treating the printmaking and the materiality of paper and canvas differently. So here we have these two very large works on Japanese kozo paper. And kozo paper is a mulberry paper. And even the paper itself is fascinating because I believe the Japanese start getting heavily involved with paper making in the 1300s. And the way paper making comes to Japan is through a Korean monk who had studied Chinese paper making and printmaking. So even within the materials used in the show, there's this history of exchange, and I think that just lends itself to the tiger imagery itself, which is again doing the same thing. And so also with these two large works, you can kind of see that the tiger has this very similar pose. And they come from Korean minhwa painting, which is Korean folk art. But you can see that one of them is more stylized and graphic, where the other is printed with these kind of more naturalistic fur lines. And as I've done research, I found a very old, I think it was 1159 AD, Chinese medicine book. And there's a little drawing of a tiger in a very similar pose. So it makes you wonder, how this image kind of got to these Korean artists, and then they start, producing the tiger images too in this same, this like curved kind of composition. And so, this show is really, one of the themes is to trace, or try to trace these origins of, this is a Korean tiger, but you can see its influence from China. And then, in Japan, there were no tigers on the island. So naturally, they looked towards Korean works and made versions from those. And then there's this back and forth. Then the Koreans are looking at Japanese prints and making variations on that. So it becomes very complicated. So again, that question of where is this from is not so simple, and I think that just, again, reflects my narrative and my personal, upbringing, and
As you've just given us a great tour of these works about the various lineages and heritages that are inherent in these works, when you're in Europe and you speak about Persia, Iran, anywhere really in the Middle East, People in Europe consider that part of Asia. But when you're in the United States and you talk about Iran, we're not raised to think of it in terms of being in Asia, even though it clearly is. People think, well, that's the Middle East and it's its own thing. And so we have a tendency to separate that culture from Asia. But your understanding and how you were raised and how you perceive of your own heritage, your own identity, is very much that it's part of Asian history. Could you maybe just talk about that difference and what that means to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I had to go to the DMV to get my identification card. And, you know, there are these several boxes. And so I tick off the Asian box and I kind of take it to the front desk and they're looking at me weird, like, yo, you're not Asian. And there's this total confusion. And I kind of since learned, like you just said, that Asia and Asian in the UK is very different than in the United States.
The DMV is the official identity, like whatever they say,
absolutely.
That's what you are.
That's what you are, right. Which again is like this very limiting way of looking at one's identity, you know. But yeah, absolutely. And if you look at my earlier works, where I'm taking images of Persian carpets and Persian miniature painting, there's this history along the Silk Road, which of course passes through Asia and gets all the way to Europe. And in these, both in the carpets and in the miniature paintings, there's documented records, you know, of East Asian painting influence in Persian painting, European influence in carpet design. So I've always been making work about these topics. I just think before the reading of my work was slightly different, where it was maybe this flat understanding of identity. Here's an artist with, you know, part Iranian heritage making Iranian images. And that was very limiting, because while that is very important to me, and I grew up with carpets, and you know, my father's Iranian, I grew up celebrating Persian New Year, my story expands beyond that. And again, what does it mean to be Iranian? Where are you from? And so to look more in depth and to understand that Persian culture was bigger than what one may originally think, and where there is this exchange in, you know, you can look at food, you can look at music. I'm doing it with painting. And in these miniature paintings, there's so much of that happening. And so I think just with the newer bodies of work, I'm doing that with other cultural histories, the Japanese influence on European art, and in these tiger images too, where it's more of an exchange within Asia.
In your Persian carpet paintings, I notice here and there a little tiger here, and are there tigers in Iran, like in the wild?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are also these Indian carpets that have the tiger, and you see it a lot in Indian art as well. And I actually recently discovered these Russian prints. There are two examples. They're supposed to be of cats, but it's very clear the Russian printmakers are again looking at East Asian tiger images. Much like a Persian carpet or a Japanese print, it becomes an icon where one can trace these histories and these exchanges.
I think another really interesting thing about this body of work that you've created for this show has to do with some of the techniques that you've used to actually make the works. And you nodded to the sort of block printing method that you're using, but you've also incorporated some other techniques that are maybe unique to a certain culture in Asia that you've sort of fostered, is the word you use, and brought. And let's specifically talk about these 6 works. You've got 6 black and white works that sort of introduce an element of collage that...
Yeah, it's this Japanese genre of collage called tsujigami. And essentially, the Japanese would take different decorative papers and cut, rip, and glue them together. And this predates collage that you see happening in Cubism. And I just felt that this physical tearing, removing and gluing talks about the way these layered histories form. So for each individual piece, the tiger is printed twice, a black on white and then a white on black. And then those images are torn, some of them are cut, and then it's just about me kind of formally playing with the positive and negative space. And then you kind of get this abstraction that's happening, or this odd back and forth where the image isn't quite sitting still. I think they create a little bit of movement, and that seems to speak about layered histories.
So this show, you've got basically has three sort of bodies of work in it, and that concept that you're working continues in the other two bodies of work. One is the large black and white works that you have, which are block printed, but you've really brought that into play with something very contemporary and very interesting, where your uncle runs a flooring.
I had started the block printing process with wood blocks, which is traditionally what is used in Japanese printmaking. There are also woodcuts from Germany too. You know, again, this is moving around. And I wanted to start making images much larger. And with wood panels, you're sort of limited by the size, which is typically 8x4. And so, yeah, my uncle had suggested this kind of throwaway flooring where it's this industrial vinyl in these ginormous rolls. And it's like leftover, weird, odd colors. And so I sourced some of this and was able to use that material to make these very large scale works. And so, yeah, of course, typically you wouldn't see something so large. And with the vinyl, it's much like a wood panel where we take small knives, carve the image into the block, and then block printing ink is rolled onto this vinyl block. And then with the large paperworks, which was very difficult because this is on this Japanese kozo paper, which took about 6 months to produce in Japan, and was sent over during quarantine. So that was something to look forward to when it finally arrived. And what I really love about it actually is that there's this transfer happening within the process. So you have the image on the block where you roll the ink, and then the paper is lowered down onto that surface. And then we take these kind of 6-inch discs called barons and apply pressure on the back. And then what happens is you peel the paper, and as you do that, the ink is transferring from one surface to another. And so I feel like that process within the printmaking is kind of what's happening conceptually in the works too, where there's this transfer from one material to another, and it's the inverse. So you have to, in the block, carve almost backwards, and then the print gives you, the positive, space. So it's, I think it kind of works really perfectly for the things that I'm thinking about.
So wonderful. And again, I'll bring up your use of the word fostering and the notion, I think the way you define it is, I'm quoting you here, temporarily nurturing something that doesn't really belong to you.
And there's one more detail, which is, when this print happens and you peel, there's almost this kissing sound, this like intimate kissing sound, and I just, for me, that's everything.
Well, this all leads really nicely into the body of work that's behind us, this series of tiger paintings, which are the only pieces in the show to incorporate color. And You mentioned Cubism a little while ago, and its declared invention of collage, which I have read in countless art history books, that, you know, Georges Braque and, you know, Picasso invented collage. But as you just brought up, you've got this Japanese collage technique that way predates Picasso and Braque. You've sort of addressed how modernist artists took a lot of credit for things that maybe they shouldn't have taken credit for, or maybe just freely borrowed in a way that they didn't really, you know, maybe it's the art critics and the historians that assigned that credit. But you've sort of addressed it in this body of work because you've chosen a color palette for the shapes that you've abstracted from the images that relates directly back to the Bauhaus, to Calder, to Mondrian, to these artists who use these sort of primary colors and abstracted shapes. Kandinsky, I see a lot of these artists in these works. Talk to me about your choice to sort of use these abstracted shapes and to especially incorporate this color palette that so clearly relates to early modernism.
Yes, I think you know, one of the ongoing projects in my studio has been to trace this modernist history and to reevaluate. I think you're right. It's usually how it's been written about in history books, in museum shows, and to expand upon the language that is something that is taught in art school, for example. And so with these tiger works, the original images come from ink painting with sumi ink. And all of these marks are quite loose. And if you were to just take one brush stroke, they really look like abstract painting that happens in America in the 40s. So with each painting here, everything in color is an extraction of a shape of a tiger stripe, or a leaf, or even an eye from a tiger, that is then kind of blown up and redrawn on top of the print, and then painted in oil in this color palette that is very reminiscent of artists like Miro, for example.
Well, there's something else about this body of work too. There's that I think also really gets to the heart of your show, and that goes to the notion of friends and family as well. But in particular, these tiger images come from a friend of yours, right? Like a very close friend, and you consider your friends family.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think like everything else in the studio, I work with different images. I'm not really planning to make anything in particular, but they naturally find that, images like this tiger image naturally found its way into the studio, and then I will embark on a body of work. And so I have a very close friend of mine, Phil Kim, who I met when I first moved to Los Angeles at art school. And Phil was Korean, but was born and raised in Chile. Moved here with his family. He's the eldest brother. And so him and I have this very similar experience of being the eldest sibling of immigrant families, having to figure out our way through the school system as international students. And we really became, to me, what feels like brothers. And Phil's a tattoo artist, very talented, and has this great belly tattoo of a Korean tiger. And so him and I used to share a studio. He then became quite successful and started traveling for work. And I probably made these paintings simply for the fact that I missed his presence. But yeah, it's funny when him and I would have these funny stories where we would enter a Mexican restaurant and the waiter or waitress would come up to me and speak to me in Spanish, asking, and obviously I don't speak Spanish, but Phil, who grew up in Chile, would reply. So they look at him and they're like, what's going on, And this was just like a perfect example of exactly, I think, what I'm trying to talk about within the work. So yeah, this is, really dedicated to him in many ways. And like you said, when you leave home and you move to a new place, you have to create your own family. And I think what's important here is that although him and I come from different countries, and we come from different cultures even, that it is our shared experience that connects and bonds us together.
Thank you. Kour Pour, it has been an absolute delight talking to you today about this body of work and about your whole practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.